You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Happy Tuesday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my program, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. If you want to come on over and check out all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio, check out the entire schedule of events and radio shows, and also all the places where you can find this show broadcast. And also, come on over to my YouTube channel. You can do that right now. As you're listening to the show over on Odyssey, come and check out the simulcast in video. And the best part about the video stream at YouTube is, of course, all the other Intrepids, the Intrepid family, joining in the live chat room during this show. Come on over, experience that. I think you'll have a good time. And you can also find every one of my radio programs since day one, last August. When we launched this show, 5 days a week, with rare exception. I've only missed about 3 or 4 shows along the way where I took a night off or we did something and we played a rebroadcast, but you can find every rebroadcast of this show over in video and watch the replay of the live chat over on my YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Yesterday, and I've got a ton of information in front of me. As I do many times during the shows and the topics we talk about, I've filled my screen full of all different references, different points, my own notes, things like that to reference while we're doing the show, because I want to make sure I don't want to go through an entire show and run out of material, which I've done before, and I can fill it pretty easily. I'm a storyteller. That's what I do. I tell stories in text. I tell stories verbally. I tell stories in pictures and illustrations. It's what I do. And so it's easy for me to fill in the gaps. However, I don't want you to notice that I have gaps to fill in. If I get to the end of my material and I go, and then there is, I've reached the end of my stuff. So I've got a ton of information talking about what we started talking about on Friday, and again last night, was the Exodus. I think this is an incredible study, only because it is so fixed in our corporate minds that this event, at least if we think it didn't take place, we know of what we believe to be the tales of the Exodus. And all the movies that come out. You think of the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston and the great Technicolor epic that came out in the late 1950s. That movie, and as well as the animated version of that, which DreamWorks did several years later in the early 90s, I want to say it was, that movie came out, and they all start by talking about the Exodus is one of the greatest stories in humanity, telling of the emancipation and the freedom of the spirit and the emancipation of slaves. And so this is stuck in our consciousness, whether we're religious, spiritual, whether we believe the story was true or not. We all know about, at least superficially, the Exodus. Moses came, said to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh said, "No, I will not let your people go." And as a matter of fact, he increases their work and so on like that for the slaves. And eventually, God sends 10 plagues to plague Egypt until Pharaoh would let his people go. And finally ending, of course, with the plague of the firstborn, where the Israelites were told to put the blood of lambs on their doorposts and on the lintel above. So the spirit, the angel of death, would pass over them and take the firstborn of everyone in Egypt. And that's where, of course, Passover comes from. That's the legend of the Passover. Did the events really happen? We don't know. I don't even know if all the spiritual aspects of this story are true. What we do know is that there is, while some scholars say there's absolutely no evidence that the Israelites were in bondage in Egypt and there was a great emancipation of slaves and they left and then settled in Canaan, we don't know that that's a true story from a spiritual aspect. And so you start looking at the archaeological and the historical evidence, and you still come up short. However, as archaeology progresses and as our study of ancient times progresses, there are all kinds of signs and hints and things that happened along the way that prove that the biblical story is at least historically accurate, that there is efficacy to the history there. Whether you want to believe God came down in a pillar of fire or a pillar of cloud, that God parted the waters of the Red Sea, which we talked about last night, whether you want to believe that God was behind any of it. Was it just simply a slave revolt that was led by one man who is said to be a man that grew up in Egypt, that grew up in the palaces of Egypt, but had Israelite blood coursing through his veins? So what do you get when you have all these things put together and you try to find out, is there historical efficacy? This is where biblical archaeology comes in. And those who may not even believe a lick of words in the Bible from a spiritual point of view are saying, is this story biblically a true story? Are there facts to back up the account? And that's what biblical archaeologists do. And when you take an event as ingrained in the, I don't want to say public, that seems to make it more colloquial, ingrained in the minds of humanity, that we know this story, we know of it, it's written of in 3 of the Abrahamic religions. If when we have this story, we know that there's something important to be said. And so we want to find out if it's true or not. And that's why I've gone through this series looking at the redating of the Exodus. I place the Exodus right around 1446 BCE, thereabouts. Now, I use a biblical reference to establish that date. And we talked about this yesterday. We know with almost 100% certainty that an Israelite king named Solomon, who is said to be the son of the second king, actually, of Israel, David, King David, the David and Goliath story and all of that. And we did talk about David to great extent for 17 episodes, which you can find on my main page here and go back and listen to those. We did that last summer. But if his son is indeed an historical king, and there's a lot of evidence proving that he existed, that his kingdom existed, we date that kingdom right into the mid-10th century, in the 900s BCE. And there is a verse that said in his 4th year of reign, in the month of Ziv, that Solomon began building the great temple in Jerusalem. This would be Temple 1. And there's still, this is something I want to talk about on this show, not tonight, but there's a lot of controversy about Temple 1 because they say it existed and stood in the same place where you see the Mosque of Omar in Jerusalem today, the domed Islamic mosque, and that was all the original temple compound. And where you see the Wailing Wall, the picture of Orthodox Hasidic Jews that will all come and pray at the wall there. That is the remnant of Herod's temple that he rebuilt, and that's the one wall that's left. And of course, you can't get beneath the Temple Mount to excavate because the Muslims will not allow it there. And that's fine. That's their religious thing. But the question is, did it exist? Did the temple exist there? There are current trains of thought that say the temple compound that you see now, that was actually the Roman Antonium, that whole compound was the huge Roman fort there, and that the temple sat just to the south of that. And there's some archaeological evidence that existed there, right adjacent this big Roman fort. So there's a lot of controversy. We'll cover that one of these days. We might segue into that at the end of this series. But the big question is, did the Exodus take place? Did the Israelites lead a conquest of the land of Canaan, city by city, taking them out? Now, if you remember the story says they left Egypt after the Exodus under the leadership of Moses. They went out into the wilderness after the crossing of the Red Sea, went to the mountain of God, the Mount Sinai, which I believe was Serabit el-Khadim. And that mountain, I've been there, and you can look at it and you can get the feel for the place. Some of it is highly subjective. John Ward and I were there, and we got the feel for the place. There's the old temples of Ptah, and Hathor are there. Hathor, the calf goddess of Egypt, was the patron goddess of the miners in the whole region there where Egyptian mines were being dug by slaves and workers. And she was the goddess of that mountain. She was also the goddess of happiness, fertility, and so on. This was her mountain, Serabit el-Khadim. And you can remember the story of the Israelites asking Aaron, Moses is up on the mountain. We don't even know where he is. He's been gone for 40 days. Build us a golden calf as a god. And this was obviously Hathor. They were very Egyptianized, these Israelites, when they came out of Egypt. They were not Jews. They were Israelite by blood, but they were Egyptian by habit, if you will, by assimilation. And so Aaron builds this golden calf, the golden calf of Hathor, which is where? At the foot of the mountain of Hathor. That makes sense. So this story, as we start to look at it unfold, Moses sent spies into the land of Canaan, the promised land that God was taking them to. And they said, the land's filled with giant human beings, and they make us look like grasshoppers in their sight, was the report that came back. But Joshua and Caleb, two of the spies, said, no, we can do it. We can take these guys. And but because of the people's unbelief, their idolatry, and all of this, God made them wander in the Sinai wilderness for 40 years as a nomadic tribe, and basically killed off the whole generation that left under the Exodus before he would allow them to go into the land. Now, what prevented them from going into the land? Obviously, a very strong religious leader, and that was Moses. Now, at the death of Moses, Joshua is the heir apparent of the leadership of Israel, and he takes over as the leader of Israel, and he begins a conquest into the land. And so they go into the promised land, and they beat the inhabitants down city by city. And they destroy these cities, they destroy the peoples, they allow some peoples to assimilate into Israel, and they take over the land. And this would have been right around 1440 BCE when this conquest started, roughly 40 years from the date of the Exodus, which I place at 1446 BCE. And so they're leading this conquest of the land of Canaan to take it over. And if this is in 1446, remember, you've already got the monarchy starting with King Saul and King David and David's supposed son, Solomon. You'll know why I say that if you go back and listen to my series on David. And this is in the mid-10th century BC, the 900s. So there's about a 500-year gap, 400 to 450 years before the first king, Saul. And you've got the series of judges, they called them, of the land before that. They were not kings, but were the next best thing. And the prophets. So Israel had been in the land of Canaan after the conquest for a good 400 to 450 years before they established their first monarchy. And so you've got this period of time that there was this slow assimilation of the land of Canaan by the Israelites, slower at the beginning, or quick at the beginning, then slower as time went on. And there was always all the warring between the tribes and so on. And then, of course, they had the peoples of the plains. They had the Amalekites. They had the Jebusites. They had the Philistines you've heard of. And all of these peoples that were constantly warring with them over the territory. And so this is the situation we're in now. We're back at 1400. We're looking at the beginning of the conquest under Joshua of the land of Canaan, of the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, as God said. And so Moses had died. He was buried by God on the top of Mount Nebo, which overlooks the promised land. Here's Moses, who is called in his old age, 80 years old, to lead Israel out of Egypt, to take the slaves home. He leads them through the wilderness for 40 years. And yet God does not allow him, according to the biblical account, God does not allow him to go to set foot into the promised land after all of that. Why? Because according to the biblical story, Moses kept doing things. He did a certain thing. He kept equating himself with God, which was a very Egyptian thing to do. If you remember the passage, and this is why I don't get into any of my material. This is all off the top of my head. This is all stuff to set the stage for where we're going tonight with this. You remember Moses, he grew up for 40 years in Egypt. For his first 40 years, and you think of somebody who's 40 years old now, and take all the things they've learned in their setting, where they are from culturally and so on, they're pretty set in their ways. Well, Moses supposedly murders an Egyptian taskmaster and flees into the wilderness. We heard that he, in the biblical story, it says he goes to the land of Midian, which is somewhere in the Sinai, and he marries Zipporah, the daughter of the high priest of Midian. Not a Jewish priest, a pagan high priest. And Jewish writings say he first went south to Ethiopia and picked up the princess there, who there was a story in the Jewish account that when Moses was a general in the armies of Egypt, that he took over a kingdom that was in rebellion, and he killed the king, and he was going to take the daughter to marriage, and he set himself up as king, and Pharaoh said, "Oh, no. You're working for me, remember? Get your ass back to Egypt." And so he leaves it. But where's the first place he goes? According to Jewish stories about the Exodus and about Moses, he goes south to Ethiopia and takes the princess for his wife. Then he flees into Midian and marries Zipporah as well. And you want more of this, you got to look into the Jewish. Maybe we'll take that topic as something that we'll talk about in a little greater detail at a future day here. So Moses then spends 40 years in Midian, another 40 years. According to the biblical tale, he's 80 years old when he has his burning bush experience, where he meets God, Jehovah God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of his fathers. Take the sandals from off your feet, for the place whereon you stand is holy ground, the voice says to him out of the burning bush. And the voice tells him, I'm God. I am that I am they speak of. Or in the vernacular, and we've talked about this before, that is the only place in the Bible where you see an ancient Mesopotamian wordplay. God is actually saying, I am that Enki they speak of. He's using a wordplay from ancient Sumeria, ancient Mesopotamia. And so it's very interesting when you start digging that apart and exegeting the passage. And, of course, looking into the linguistics of it and the wordplay that was common in the day, the context. So Moses goes back and he leads the people out. And then he spends the last 40 years of his life, the 3 segments of 40 of Moses, from 80 years old to 120 years old. He is the leader of Israel in the wilderness, and then he dies. And God doesn't let him set foot in the promised land because of his sin of pride, his sin of idolatry to a certain sense. In the very Egyptian sense of the word, Moses believed himself to be a brother to the gods. If you remember the passage, and I've talked about this before as well, it says Moses pitched his tent outside the camp of Israel, meaning he really set himself apart from them. His tent, see, was over here. I led you guys out, but I'm not fraternizing with you. And it says there that God met Moses face to face in his tent and spoke to him face to face as a man talks to his friend. That's according to what Moses wrote. But then later in the same chapter, 9 verses later, Moses says, "No man can see God's face and live." So there was this thing that you can't see God's, but I can. He meets with me face to face. What's he saying there? Is that a contradiction? No. He was establishing the fact that no man can see God's face and live, but he comes and talks to me face to face. Why? He is a brother to the gods. He is, that's one of the things about this guy back here over my shoulder, this bust. Senenmut is the man that I believe was Moses. And even his name means, Hatshepsut, the queen pharaoh, gave him that name in his career in Egypt in his first 40 years. And Senenmut means mother's brother. I, your mother, Hatshepsut, the mother of Egypt, I, your mother, am elevating you from my son to the brother to the gods with me. Remember, the Pharaoh was a god in Egypt. And so Moses grew up believing this. And so I don't think he was this, they try to paint this picture of Moses in theological settings as being, by faith, Moses kept his faith in God, and Judaism, which didn't exist at the time, the unencoded Judaism, pre-Judaism, and that he eschewed all the gods of Egypt and all of this stuff. No, I think he was as Egyptian as they come, by assimilation. And it wasn't until he was 80 years old that he turned his back on all of that, because he supposedly met God face to face. And through the rest of his life and career as the leader of Israel, I believe he kept establishing himself as, I am one with God, I am the brother of God, because he's carrying that all over from ancient Egyptian practice, and being a high noble. And even Hatshepsut, she gave him, during his first 40 years, 92 different Egyptian titles. He was the Grand Vizier. Which was Pharaoh in the place of Pharaoh, one step off the throne. She gave him the High Priest of Amun. She gave him the Grand Royal Architect. And his name, Senenmut. You are mother's brother. You are one of the gods. The mother is her, and she is one of the gods in Egypt. So this is what he grew up believing about himself. And this is what I believe he took into his leadership of Israel. And God kept, according to the story, knocking him down a peg, because you're getting too cocky, Moses. I'm God, not you. And this is eventually why God said, okay, that's it. He says, I'm not going to let you into the land. You can see it from the top of Mount Nebo before you die, but you don't get to set your foot in the land. And after all that he had done. Now, I think it would be really interesting to go back and see these people and meet these people in their environments and what they were really like. Probably a totally different picture than what we get from these stories. So all of this leading up to my saying what we're talking about tonight is again the conquest that took place after the death of Moses. And this is all established on the dating of Egypt, of the Exodus from Egypt in 1446. We're at the end of the first segment, believe it or not, and we haven't even started the material for tonight. So let's come back after the break, dig into this a little bit. You're gonna enjoy this. So sit tight for 2 minutes. We'll be right back. Hey gang, thanks for waiting through that break. We're back. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid Radio Program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Check it out. And you can also come on over, if you're not already, to the live chat room going on in the video simulcast of this show right now over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Let's jump into the Exodus, shall we? And the conquest of the land. This is where we left off. I kind of spent the whole first 25 minutes of this show setting the stage again for what we're talking about tonight. And we had mentioned last night, we talked about this key verse. And this is where I'm going to kind of pick it up as a way of a little bit of a recap. If you go in the Old Testament to the book of 1 Kings, look at chapter 6 and verse 1. There we're told that Solomon began building the temple in the 4th year of his reign, and that this was 480 years after the Exodus took place. Now, Solomon's reign can be dated with considerable confidence to about 971 to 931 BCE, that 40-year window. So the 4th year of his reign would be right around 967 BCE. Now, we don't know if they're using rounded numbers. It appears that they are in things. So these are approximate dates, give or take a few years in either direction. By a few years, I mean 3 or 4 or 5 years in either direction. So according to the biblical chronology, this would place the Exodus 480 years earlier than 967 and the 4th year of Solomon's reign in the month of Ziv. And if you do that, you end up with about 1446 to 1447 BCE. And you can say 1450 for convenience. It was right around the middle of the 1400s BCE. And so this is when the Exodus took place. Now you can go to the chronology of the Egyptian kings and you can see a pretty solid record around that time period. Now while the chronologies, there's 4 of them, and there's a 5th that was added by one guy. They kind of go, they overlap and they spread around these different chronologies of the Egyptian kings. And it all depends on whether they saw one king as a co-regent for a number of years and started his reign, to they skip a pharaoh for some reason, whatever. So they kind of shift around. But what you've got is the basic, and I took this from the Oxford Accepted Chronology of the Egyptian Kings, is that the pharaohs that would have been alive around this period of time would have been the Tutmosian dynasty. So you think of the man Moses, the pharaohs around him were Tutmosis the first, Tutmosis the second, Tutmosis the third. And then you've got Hatshepsut in between the second and the third of Tutmosis. And then by the time Moses would have come back to Egypt, you've got the son of the elderly 80-year-old Tutmosis III, now on the throne, Amenhotep II. And I believe he was the pharaoh of the Exodus. And you just look at these dates, and we can cover that in more detail. I covered it in my book, and then we talked about that to great extent many times before, a couple of times before. So what you've got here is that according to the biblical chronology, the Exodus was around 1446, 1447. Call it 3 years later, or 3 years earlier, 1450 BCE. Now, another biblical text, Judges 11 and verse 26, indicates that the Israelites had been settled in the Transjordan for 300 years by the time of King Jephthah, one of the judges. I'm sorry, he wasn't a king, he was one of the judges of Israel. Remember I said that there was that span of time between the Exodus and the time of David and Solomon of about 450 to 500 years? Well, according to when he was a judge over Israel, it said they would have already been in Israel for about 300 years. And about 1400 BCE again, almost 200 years before the generally accepted date, the GAD. So admittedly, the figure of 480 years, as we mentioned last night, that's used in 1 Kings and the 300 years used in Judges sound like approximations. And this is because you've had the texts all rewritten 1,000 years after the 1400 event by the 72 Jewish rabbis who went to the Library of Alexandria to reestablish the Jewish history and scriptures from the scrolls that were kept there. And they end up with some gaps, and this is why I think you don't have the names of the kings. You have some of the names like Pi-Ramses, which we're going to talk about a bit tonight. The city of Pi-Ramses, Pithom and Ramses, and like the twin cities there, and built by Ramses. This is why you've got the names that could seem to miss the fact that Avaris was the city beneath it. And so we're told in Exodus 1 that the Israelites enslaved in Egypt built for Pharaoh these store cities of Pithom and Ramses. And the statement's been used to date the Exodus in two ways. The first, the very name of Ramses himself, and I lost my place in my notes here. Sorry about that. The very name of Ramses recalls the Egyptian name of Ramses. Ramses the Great, Ramses the Second. This pharaoh indeed built a royal residence in the city called Pi-Ramses in the eastern Nile Delta. And it's therefore been taken to indicate that the Israelites cannot have left Egypt before the reign of Ramses II. However, the Bible doesn't use the name Ramses with chronological rigor. It's evident from its use in Genesis 47, the book just before this, and the few chapters in Genesis. Exodus is just the book 2 of Genesis almost, Exodus. It just picks up where Genesis leaves off. And so in that verse in Genesis 47, it spells the name Ramses, Rameses instead of Ramesses, and it's used to describe the region in the delta in which the patriarch Jacob and his sons settled under Joseph. And so is there evidence that building activity went on the site of Ramses at an earlier time than the reign of Ramses II? Yes, there is. So when you see the Bible saying that Ramses, the Israelites built the treasure cities or the store cities of Pithom and Ramses, it's really a later author that is saying, those cities that exist there now, those are the cities that were built by the Israelites. Well, actually not. It was the city beneath them. Pharaoh Ramesses II took that city and rebuilt them as Pithom and Ramses. So the evidence of an earlier occupation at Pi-Ramses dates to 19th to the 17th centuries BCE. We're talking 300 to 400 years earlier than the Exodus. How long did the Bible story say the enslavement in Egypt took place with the Israelites? About 300 to 400 years. So that's when the city dates to. And this was when a major administrative center was first developed on the site. Archaeologists have been unearthing the long history of this important city since the 1930s. And it lies at Katana Kantir, the district of Egypt's eastern delta, in the region that was known in the Bible as Goshen, the place where the Israelites dwelt, where they settled initially. And the culture was excavated from this early period, and it has a strong Syro, S-Y-R-O, Syrian meaning, Syro-Canaanite or Palestinian, if you will, element to it. And it closely resembles the contemporaneous Canaan, the Middle Bronze too. And so, archaeologically speaking. And so this is how archaeology works. If you watch a show, I watch a show called Time Team. It's been going on for 20 plus years, and I think it's no longer making new episodes, but it's the one with Sir Tony Robinson. And if you were fans of Blackadder, if you remember that show with Rowan Atkinson, his idiot servant was Baldric, played by Tony Robinson, who in real life is very much into archaeology. I think he's an archaeologist. And he was knighted by the Queen after all the shows on television that he did on the history of Great Britain. But they would dig things up in farmers' fields and they'd find pottery. And they're looking for Roman occupation. And yet they find a piece of pottery in the shard and they can tell by the way the pottery was made what era that came from. So this is what you've got when you talk about, this is a Bronze Age pottery. This is Iron Age pottery. or this is medieval pottery. You can tell the difference. And so they're looking at the Middle Bronze II period, which places it right at the right time for Israelites to be in Egypt and having built a city there. And this suggests that the migration of Canaanite groups into the Delta region had been going on for hundreds of years prior to the Exodus. And it was just migration. They came in, they settled during times of famine in Canaan. Remember, the Egyptians called them the Asiatics. They came from the Canaanite region. They established homes there. They infiltrated. It sounds like a negative word. They adapted. They assimilated into the towns and the culture there. And eventually they took over the northern throne. We talked about that yesterday with the Hyksos. And this was the time of Joseph when that happened. So now we've got to turn a little bit to the evidence regarding the city of Pithom, this Pi-Ramses or Pithom and Ramses, these two cities. There are two possible sites for the biblical Pithom. One of them is Tel El Meskuta, and I talked about this last night, or Tel El Rataba. And these two sites lie about 8 miles apart in the Wadi Tumalat region. Remember that region? That's the wadi that I believe the Israelites followed when they left Egypt, and it took them to the northern tip of the Red Sea and the Bitter Lakes and the Sea of Reeds and so on, which is the wetlands almost, you could call them, in the shallow lake up north of the tip of the Red Sea, which is where I believe they crossed the Red Sea. It was at the Bitter Lakes. We talked about that last night and some of the geology behind that. So archaeologists and Egyptologists have traditionally held a very different view of this Syrio-Canaanite culture in the eastern delta. They associate it with the forerunners of the Hyksos. That's Semitic peoples. The shepherd kings, they were known as in Egypt. And they found all types of pottery, weapons, and things like that were used by the Hyksos people on this site, below Pi-Ramses. In short, the reference to Pithom and Ramses in Exodus 1 can't be used to date the Exodus to the 13th century BC. Rather, the archaeological evidence makes the best sense if Exodus chapter 1, verse 11, refers to the beginning of Israelites' enslavement in about the 18th dynasty. It was prior to the 18th dynasty, and not to the time of the Exodus. Another traditional reason for dating the Exodus to the 13th century BCE involves archaeological evidence from Transjordan that more recent scholarship has undermined. Surface surveys of Transjordan, carried out by Nelson Glueck chiefly in the 1930s, it led him to conclude that much of the region was without a settled population during the Middle Bronze II period and the Late Bronze periods, and that is between the 19th and the 13th centuries. Transjordan was mainly unpopulated. And the traditions preserved in the Bible and Numbers chapter 20 through 22 require the existence of strong kingdoms in Edom and Moab in the Transjordan, as well as farther north. And at the time when Israel was moving northward through the region on the final march to Canaan. And this led many scholars to conclude that Israel's encounter with Edom, Moab, and the other kingdoms east of the Jordan could not be dated before the 13th century BCE. That is the time of Ramesses II. And this has become a standard line of argument in this generally accepted date for the Exodus and the conquest. That century and no earlier, is what they say. However, Glueck's conclusions have been heavily modified during just the last 30 years alone, although many authorities have been slow to recognize this fact. Further surveys and excavations have brought to light numerous Middle Bronze Age II and Late Bronze Age settlements that were missed by Glueck. For example, a survey in 1963, we're talking already almost 60 years ago, 55 years ago, 63 to 66, found 18 sites from the Middle Bronze II period and almost as many from the Late Bronze I to II periods. A survey in 1975, so we're talking now 45 years ago, discovered 14 Middle Bronze II and 6 late bronze sites. More sites from both periods were found during a survey work in 1978. Now, Maxwell Miller reports that the findings of a recent survey of central Moab, which is Transjordan, seems to, and by the way, get the geography in your head, Israel is west of the Jordan up to the Mediterranean. That's the span. You go east of the Jordan, you're in Jordan nowadays, or Transjordan in biblical context. That certainly, he said, there's nothing here that will provide us with a precise date for the emergence of the Moabite kingdom or for the Israelite exodus from Egypt. Now, significantly, at sites where Glueck's own investigations were more intensive than usual, he often found pottery from the Middle Bronze II period and the Late Bronze periods, which makes sense for the biblical story. But when he initially published his conclusions, he didn't give these finds the emphasis they deserved. And Glueck did, however, revise his views shortly before he died. So in the case of Dibon, which we talked about last Friday, it deserves a separate discussion. Excavations at Dibon are the supposed site of the Moabite capital, Dibon, have shown that no town existed there before Iron Age 1, about 1200 to 1000 BCE. Yet Dibon is mentioned in Numbers 21 as a town existing in the time of Moses. So you can see how there was confusion with the dating system. Archaeologists are saying it didn't exist. Dibon didn't exist before 1200 BCE. And yet the Bible story, you can place that in the 1400s BCE. And so, while some scholars have inclined to solve the problem by treating the biblical references as anachronisms, mistakes in chronology, this can't be correct because there's contemporaneous evidence for Dibon's existence at an earlier time. Now, I don't want this to get muddled and confusing for you. The importance of this kind of archaeological work is to establish whether or not the biblical account matches the historical account. And if it doesn't, you got to throw it out as being false narrative. But if it matches, this is why they put such great importance into digging this stuff up. Dibon is almost certainly mentioned in an Egyptian topographical list from the reign of Tutmosis III. Remember, I mentioned him before. Tutmosis III was the stepson of the great female pharaoh Hatshepsut. Her husband, Tutmosis II, died. And he's 3 years old, Tutmosis III, but he's the rightful pharaoh. She says, my dad, Tutmosis I, wanted me to reign. This is what he groomed me for. And she became the queen. She was his co-regent with the 3-year-old for about 6 years old. Then she sent him up to Memphis, Mennefer, and he grew up there in the palaces in the north. It wasn't her son. It was her husband's son through a harem wife. But 20-plus years later, when Hatshepsut dies, he's in his late 20s. He takes over as pharaoh, and he rules for, about another 45 years. And so Tutmosis III, in his list, his topographical list, and by the way, Senenmut, this guy, who I believe was Moses would have grown up almost a contemporary of Tutmosis III. He would have grown up in Egypt in the house of the nobles. And this is where Hatshepsut, I believe, I didn't mention this before because it wasn't in context, I believe Hatshepsut, the daughter of Tutmosis I, was the woman who found Moses as an infant in the basket in the Nile River, according to the Bible story. She would have been 7 to 10 years old. She was the daughter of Pharaoh. That was her title, Pharaoh's daughter. Remember, she sent the baby back to his mother to be weaned until she was old enough to bring him and take him on her own, which she eventually did. The Bible story doesn't tell when. It just jumps from the birth to when Moses is 40. And it doesn't mention Hatshepsut at all, but it does mention the daughter of Pharaoh. And this was Matkare, who bore the title daughter of Pharaoh, who became, her regnal name was Hatshepsut. And when she went to the throne, she brought Senenmut in. And I believe she was the woman who found him in the Nile. It's not as fantastical a story as you might think. It's just been made into legend and mythology over the years. So Moses' mother places him in a basket and deliberately has her daughter, Miriam, Moses' older sister, follow the basket and bring it into the canal of the Nile that would have washed up into the royal palace, where the princess was bathing with her servant women. And they find this basket. And it was to save the life of the baby. And so the explanation for the whole discrepancy of Dibon, looking back now, jumping back to Tutmosis III, it definitely occurs in the text of Ramses II, thus providing its existence at least as early as the late Bronze Age, the city of Dibon. And so the explanation for this discrepancy between the written evidence, and including the Bible, and the archaeology of Dibon is probably that the Bronze Age Dibon was located at another site and is so far undiscovered. Now that sounds like an easy out, but that's probably the case. So because the city existed in a topographical list long before the time of Ramesses II, almost 200 years earlier. So the same may apply to Heshbon, another town that existed in the time of Moses, according to Numbers 21. And excavations at Tel Heshbon have produced no remains from before about 1200 BCE. And it's possible, however, that Heshbon of earlier periods should be sought at Tel Jalul. It's a large, unexcavated mound farther to the south, with Middle and Late Bronze Age surface shards of pottery that have been found. So the important point, which has been reinforced again and again in recent decades, is that Glueck's initial conclusions were definitely wrong about these cities in the Transjordan. And it's disappointing to find scholars citing them as if they were still valid evidence against an earlier date for the Exodus. And all too often, the 13th century date for the Exodus has been perpetuated by the baseless repetition of outmoded archaeological views. Boom, gotta say that. Get that in your mind. The 13th century, the 1200s date of the Exodus is outmoded because of research that's been done. So the view that Israel arrived in the land of Canaan, the promised land, at the end of the late Bronze Age, about 1230 to 1220 BCE, is now so entrenched in people's minds, the generally accepted date, the GAD, that biblical scholars and archaeologists regard the culture of the Iron Age as Israelite, in contrast to the Canaanite culture of the late Bronze Age. And this prejudges the issue, and it encourages a circular argument. Some have used the appearance of Israelite culture in the late 13th century BCE in Canaan to support their dating of the conquest settlement. So they're taking things that were generally accepted dates based on wrong information, and so they don't have the right dates, and they stick to it. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Now, I think it's important to find these dates that are appropriate, that are accurate, that are true, because it establishes the biblical story as being an honest story of the times and of what happened. And now, let me state here, I had an old seminary professor of mine when I was writing one of my books on the Nephilim. He says, remember, Scotty, he says, you need to use the Bible as your sole authority for establishing dates and practice. If it doesn't fit into the biblical record, then it's false. And I said, I have a problem with that. I said, I want to go outside the biblical record and establish that the evidence suggests that the biblical record is true, not say that the historical record is simply wrong because the Bible says it this way. Well, the interesting thing about that is the Bible, if you take the faith elements out, is an historical book with an historical record. So that's why we do biblical archaeology. That's why we look into these things. And there's actually no unequivocal proof that the culture of the Iron Age, 1200 to 1000 BCE, should be associated with the arrival of the Israelites in the land of Canaan. Indeed, with the exception of the introduction of the Philistine, where, in the coastal region, there's sufficient continuity between the cultures of Late Bronze and Iron Age 1 to make it doubtful that the latter marks the arrival of any newcomers at all. More importantly, as Patricia Beckay recently wrote, she said, the shift from the richness of the late Bronze Age to the apparent poverty of early Iron Age 1 is a phenomenon which extends into the whole of Canaanite and Eastern Mediterranean culture, and not just that section affected by the arrival of the Israelites. So, whatever the reason for the widespread cultural change at the start of the Iron Age, the climactic changes, socioeconomic decline have been suggested, it cannot be attributed to the Israelites. What was going on in the 1200s in Canaan had nothing to do with the invading Israelites. Now, I'm not saying that Iron Age 1 culture should not be associated with the Israelites at all. I'm simply denying that it marks their arrival. It's our contention that the Israelites were already in Canaan during the late Bronze Age, during the 1200s, along with other peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean, and they participated in the changes which marked the transition to the Iron Age, but they cannot be held solely responsible for those changes. And we've seen that there's no solid evidence for placing the Exodus and the conquest or the settlement by Israel in Canaan into the 13th century BCE Canaan. And I'm therefore justified in experimenting with the neglected biblical date of roughly 200 years earlier. And we got to end there. We're out of time. We're going to pick this up on tomorrow night's show. I hope you find this fascinating and interesting. Some of the material can get bogged down. We're talking about the academics of it all, but I hope that you get the picture that we're presenting of the Exodus, the date of the Exodus, the conquest, and all of that, and that you're enjoying this. Thanks for being here. We're going to be back tomorrow night, 23-hour break, and we'll be right back, so sit tight.